Good evening, Ellen.
Hello. Nice to meet you all. I guess tonight was the night that I was supposed to be with you, and what a beautiful evening it is here in Vermont, and I'm sure it is in Connecticut as well. Am I supposed to start now? I didn't hear
Yeah,
the introduction.
yes,
My
we did.
turn. Okay.
Yes, for sure.
Thank you. So I'm going to share with you the art of growing food, which is what I call my 6 steps to successful kitchen garden design. And I'm going to give you a little intro about how I got started doing kitchen garden designs and why I think it's important to start with a plan and to start with the design, and to show you a few designs from my book, and talk a little bit about my book that's coming out next January. And also, I'm not sure if my introducer mentioned that I will be coming to give a live talk on November 12th. So I hope to meet all of you in person at that time. So I'm sitting in I have a little garden room here in Vermont. You can see the lilacs in the background, and you might hear my birds outside. I have the door open. But I'm going to start now with a screen share, and I'm going to just talk because that's what these things are all about. But if you have questions while I'm talking, you can please put them into the chat. And then at the end of my talk, I'll talk for about 45 minutes, then I'll be able to answer some of your questions. And so let's get started. We all set? We all set, everybody?
We are. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Let's just get this technical stuff going here. Where do I start? It's always hard to do the first sort of 5 minutes, but I like to say that it always amazes me that I'm actually talking about kitchen gardens, because I really am a fairly recent gardener. I mean, I've been gardening now for maybe 30 years, but when I first started gardening, it was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. I am mostly a cook. I married a man who loved to garden, but he was very controlling in his garden, and he didn't let me go in the garden, but he loved to bring me all the food and the produce from the garden. And at the time, I actually had a little design business where I was making quilted vests and selling them to stores. And so I was working a lot with fabric. So the garden looked very dirty to me. It's like I didn't really want to go out there and get dirty, but I loved all that fresh food. And one of my roles as a cook was that I was always coming up with new recipes for things that my husband was growing out in the garden. And this is really just a short introduction about how we evolved into our gardening life together, but we started a seed catalog called The Cook's Garden, and maybe some of you know The Cook's Garden. But the idea is that we wanted to grow things that we couldn't buy in the grocery store. We wanted to have some wonderful European heirloom vegetables that we had seeds for because friends had gone to Europe and brought them back to us. And so we ended up ordering a lot of seeds from some of these seed houses in Italy and in France, and needed to find a way to sell them. So we started a seed catalog. And my job was to come up with recipes to get people to try things. Like, I'm not sure if you can see my little cursor here, but this beautiful Claytonia, which is actually a wild green, has a wonderful lemony, citrusy kind of a taste to it. And some wonderful things like this troutback lettuce and some Chiriola chicory. These are all greens that back in 1980, nobody had really heard of. And even this green that we now know of called arugula was something that many people didn't really have in their vocabulary. So ever since we had the seed catalog, I've really loved salad greens. It's really that's really what I mostly focus on in my garden. I grow about 50 different kinds of lettuces. I grow lots of different greens. These are all things that I have evolved to really appreciate. But one of the things with our catalog is we were getting a lot of seeds from Italy and chicories. We got heavily into chicories, but I didn't know how to cook chicory. And so I decided after doing this for about 10 years that I needed to go to cooking school in Italy. And I studied with Marcella Hazan and learned a little bit about Italian vegetables, but it was really when I went to the Ballymaloe School in Shanagary, Ireland, the year after that, that I really became a gardener. And this is really where my education as a gardener started, and what I learned about how to design kitchen gardens. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard of Ballymaloe School, but you might take a note of it. It's a fabulous little cooking school in West Ireland, West Cork. In the Shanagary, there's nothing in the town particularly except for this wonderful cookery school. And these gardens were the first time I realized that gardening didn't have to be work. They didn't have to be full of dirt that would get everywhere. They weren't, plastic greenhouses where they were growing the tomatoes and peppers like we were. They were beautiful, beautiful gardens. And I was so inspired. I spent 2 weeks here. And I realized that kitchen gardens, a truly beautiful kitchen garden, opens up all of your senses. Just walking in through that green arbor was full of birds chirping, and walking into the space, the smell of the boxwood and the lovage and the thyme and the rosemary that was just abundant. And I'm standing up on a little platform looking down into this garden, and I realized that opening up all of my senses were just alive. And this is what I really wanted in my own backyard, essentially. So I did what any smart woman would do. I called home and told my husband I wasn't coming home. But we had 2 young children, and he said, well, what do you need to come home? And I said, we just need to grow some beautiful gardens. We can't just have these production gardens. We need to have places that are alive with smells and fragrance and visuals. And so coming back home, I realized that it was important to always keep something beautiful in your mind. And this is where I want to take you to today, is trying to figure out how to turn your garden into perhaps not a garden like this, but to be inspired by a garden like this, to know that this is designed by Rosemary Veary, and it's on a plantation in Kentucky. But the elements of this garden is really what I learned from. I didn't go to I went to cooking school, but I didn't go to design school, and I wish I had. But instead, I decided to really look at a lot of pictures, read a lot of books, and really understand classic design, and then use that in the food gardens that I would design for my books. So looking at this picture, you see different things like this beautiful white bench at the end. That's that focal point that we know about, where you go into this space and you want to walk down and go to that bench and sit. If it didn't have that bench, you might just sort of look in and go, oh, those are really interesting trees. I love the way they're square around the base of them instead of round, but you probably wouldn't walk all the way to that bench. And little elements like these wonderful obelisks, these tutors that are just give it the garden a little drama, a little height, or something even as simple as this square garden here, which has been turned into a triangular garden with paths and edged in boxwood. And so looking at gardens is really how I learned how to do garden design. And these are some of the things we're going to talk about today. So where do ideas come from? Where do you get ideas? Where do they start? Well, I'm a great believer in, we borrow all of our ideas, and I must admit that I've gotten most of my best ideas from other gardeners. And, that's why we have garden clubs and why you're here today. So just always going out and seeing different gardens. Maybe you've been fortunate and have been able to travel to see the gorgeous gardens at the Chateau de Villandry and the Chateau de Versailles, and the way that they have set these gardens up based on this 4-square method, which is something that I use a lot in my designs. But as you can see, each one of these gardens is really essentially a 4-square, just interpreted in different ways. And one of the premises of this garden is that orderliness is godliness. And so they wanted to have beautiful, meticulous, well-designed gardens. And then you fast forward into the gardens in Colonial Williamsburg, and that four square design is an element that is used frequently in those gardens as well. And as an organic gardener, I believe that the four square system of being able to rotate that garden is really applicable to this design. Again, a beautiful little garden in Colonial Williamsburg here with the lovely little white benches and framed in those beds. Or this garden here, which is clearly in England somewhere, I believe, and it's a photo I took off Pinterest. But I became rather obsessed with this notion of that four square design. So just to touch a little bit on what the four square organic rotation is, it's when you rotate your crops. When you're growing vegetables, it's important not to grow the same thing every year in the same place, because that's when you're going to deplete the soil and you're more likely to then have weaker plants, and then you're more likely to have diseased plants. And so when you start with a four square rotation, you can start by growing your legumes, your peas and your beans in one block, and then the roots in another block, and the fruits and the flowering. That doesn't necessarily mean flowers, but any kind of vegetable that flowers, like a zucchini or a cucumber or an eggplant. And then the leafy greens, those salad greens, the chard, the kale. And then you'll rotate it. So the legumes that have been growing in this block will then get the leafy greens. And since the legumes have been setting nitrogen into the soil, they're more likely to have, the soil has been built up and it's nitrogen rich, so it will give those leafy greens a nice boost. And then the legumes will go into the root block, and the roots have been absorbing all the nutrition from the soil, and the legumes will put it back in again. And then the roots go to where the fruits and the flowers and so it keeps rotating every year. So ideally, when you're designing a kitchen garden, if you can set it up on that classic four square design, it will make your job a little bit easier, and it will also feed your soil naturally. Now, when I first started writing The Complete Kitchen Garden, this book right here, which came out actually in 2011, but now that everybody is really jumping on this bandwagon of growing food, it's a really important time to be thinking about how to grow food, but not just putting a raised bed in the front yard and plopping some tomato plants in there, but really getting into the whole idea of growing food for the long term and designing that garden, thinking that you're going to be, or knowing that you're going to be in that garden and continuing to add to it, and that garden is going to be not just feeding you food, but also giving you that sense of a wonderful, healthy well-being and lifestyle. And that really starts with putting a design on paper first and then going through the steps. And so that's what I'm going to share with you, with these 6 steps to success, which is how I've been building all of my designs that I've been doing for my various books and for garden clients that I work with. So step number 1 is a design plan. And the quote, "always keep something beautiful in your mind," is very important, because you need to just be looking at all kinds of ideas. Before we had Pinterest and the internet, we had scrapbooks, and that's how I would keep a lot of my designs, just ripping out pages from magazines when I was at the hairdresser, or whenever I found something, I just had files full of beautiful designs, and really starting to look at what you have. So most people have a garden that looks like this. It's an ordinary garden, but it's a nice garden. It has a beautifully mulched paths. It has a garden gate, and notice the wildflowers in the back, so the pollinators are able to find the plants. And notice there's a Buddha under the tree, under the apple tree, so there's a chance that the person who owns this garden, who is a neighbor down the road, spends a little bit of time in that garden meditating and thinking about it. But where I want to take you to in this design class, this is a really short, quick design class, and is to a garden that looks like this. This garden is the same size, but it has a little bit more creativity and imagination, and there's texture, and there's height, and there's drama and intrigue, and there's food, and there's flowers, and all of them are growing together in this wonderfully this wonderful tapestry of greenery. And so how do we get to that point? How do we go from ordinary to extraordinary? Well, I'll share a little tip with you. This was my backyard when I first moved in, and it came with that raised bed and that garden shed and that rhubarb plant. And this is what most people's gardens look like. And at first I was thinking, there's no way I can do anything with this. I'll just keep growing in this little raised bed because that's there. And I can't tell you how many people I know who have asked me to help them with their garden design. And I'll go to their house and they'll have a garden. And I say, why did you choose to put your garden here? Well, because it was already there. Well, I did the same thing, but I started to change it a little bit. And it started by taking what I call my 5-year plan. And this is where I always start my design classes and my garden clients, is I say, if you were a bird and you could fly above your house and look down, what would it look like? What would your landscape look like? How is it connected to your neighbors? Where is there water? Where are there trees? Where are there obstacles? And so this is what my 5-year plan looked like. This was my house and my driveway, and south is down here. So there was really only one place I could put that kitchen garden. And then I started to fill in the backyard, which is more where I hang out with my family, and there's a little patio garden. And I have to say, I've been in my house now 15 years, and I'm really still on year 4 of my 5-year plan. But you know, it just takes time, and it gives me something to continue to dream about. But I did put in my kitchen garden after the 2nd year. In year 2, and starting to use that 4-square design plan by getting rid of all of the grass and the weeds, and then sculpting it out, painting it out, and then putting in a little tree in the center for my focal point, and putting a bench in that garden. Now, I know it looks kind of funny. It's like, you know, an empty house with one piece of furniture in there before I have the plants in. But if you leave with only one thing today, I hope it's that you'll find a bench and put it in your garden, preferably 2 benches. I find that benches are one of these things that you may not find a lot of time to sit down, but when you do want to sit down, it's nice to have the bench there. And I spend a lot of time sitting on the bench. It's not that I'm lazy, it's just that I spend a time contemplating and looking and observing and thinking, and maybe it's just a place to throw my iPhone. But as the garden starts to evolve, I do what I call my walkthrough, putting the stakes and the twine and setting it up so you can really see how that garden is starting to evolve. You recognize where the garden shed is now in that same wheelbarrow. And finally getting to the planting stage. And I start most of my seedlings. I don't have a greenhouse, but since I'm growing mostly cold hardy greens, I'm able to grow a lot of things outside just with a simple covering. And then I start planting that garden. And one of the beautiful things about growing a lot of greens is I do a lot of succession planting. So once I put the lettuce in, my lettuce actually went in a few weeks ago, and it's going to be ready to harvest in about another week. I'll put another crop of lettuce in. So every 2 weeks I'm constantly sowing seeds, and sometimes I have heads of lettuce and sometimes it's just rows of arugula. But there doesn't have to be a master plan. It's just kind of keeping things going all the time. So step number 2 are garden beds. And as you can see, my garden beds are more traditional. They're what are called the flush to the ground kind of garden beds rather than a raised bed. Maybe you live in a condominium and you don't have room for a big garden and you just want to grow a little something in a hanging basket with the little flowers. Well, that certainly works. But most people have raised beds. That seems to be the way most people are going these days. And I have mixed feelings about raised beds. We can talk about it after the talk, but raised beds are good, but I think it means that you're not really working with the soil. I hear so many people say, I don't have good soil, or I want to keep the weeds out. And honestly, it's a little bit more work to work with your soil, but it's really important to understand your soil. And when you have raised beds, so often people just go out and get bag soil. And, bag soil to me is kind of like fast food. You don't really know where it came from, and it's a quick instant fix. And then you have that big wad of plastic you have to dispose of. And so I kind of go, bag soil. But I certainly understand if that's what you want to do, that's your choice. But the other thing about raised beds is often they're 4 feet long and 6 feet wide. I mean, 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, and people stack them like this, kind of right next to each other. And I sort of call it the graveyard garden, because in the middle of the winter, that garden, you don't really get to see what it looks like under there. You just have this kind of these mounds under the snow. So if you do have the graveyard garden, there are things you can do. You can plant containers, you can put some vertical elements in that space and give it a little bit more life. This is another example of a raised garden, which is really just a slightly raised garden. This is Paige Dickey's garden, or her former garden when she was in Sharon. And Sharon, or where she wasn't in Sharon, I can't remember where she was from, but you can see how beautifully laid out this garden is, and it just has a little edge that keeps the gravel out of the garden, and she just worked right with the soil that she already had. This is a wonderful example of a true graveyard garden, the big heavy stones. And when I first saw this garden, it's in Newfane, Vermont, is Barbara Kafka's garden. I thought, oh my gosh, those are so ugly. Why would she do that? And she had a stonemason put them in. And then I realized that the stones were holding in the heat. And in Vermont, we have such a short growing season, yet she was able to grow tomatoes and eggplants and crops that would be 2 weeks earlier than my garden, and 2 weeks later in the spring, and then 2 weeks later in the fall. So she was able to use those stones to heat up the soil. And once I realized that, I thought, brilliant, what a great strategy. When you're thinking about design, you may want an heirloom garden and have a lovely little wicker fence. Okay, what's the name of these? They're called, I can't, it's wattle fencing, thank you. These are the gardens down at Chanticleer in Pennsylvania. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend going to visit when they reopen. And it's a lovely little garden, and they make these wattle fences from willows and clipping green branches around their property, which I think is such a lovely effect. It doesn't really hold the soil in, but it certainly might discourage the rabbits from getting in. And then some garden like this, I love this garden. I call it the Sunray Garden, and those are lemon gems in the center, and it's surrounded by red cabbages and then beets, and it's just a wonderful reminder that when you're working with a vegetable garden, it's always a blank canvas for ideas every year, because you're working just with annuals. It's not like you're putting in plants and you have to think exactly where they're going to go because they're going to be there forever, and how much room they need. It's really something that you can always change every year. So all the gardens I've ever had, I've never done the same thing twice. So step number 3, paths. Don't judge each day by the harvest you reap, but by the seeds that you plant. Robert Louis Stevenson, I love that quote, and it's, it's just a reminder of our role as gardeners, but also a metaphor for each day as we go forward. But it doesn't have anything to do with paths, but paths are really the bones of the garden. As you know, they are what hold the garden together in terms of design and how you're going to get from point A to point B. And especially in a garden like this, which is, she calls this her kitchen garden. This is up in Charlotte, Vermont, but it's really mostly a flower garden. There is a little bit of food in there, but I think it's so abundant and so colorful. And I love the backdrop of the dark black of the barn in the background. But without that path, it would just look like a weedy mess. And the opposite of that would be this garden in Colonial Williamsburg, which, albeit it's early spring, it's April, and things haven't really grown up. But I love the way there's an option here. You can either go straight ahead or you can walk zigzaggy through the garden. And every time I look at this picture, there's one thing that's missing, and I wish I could talk to all of you and ask you what that is, but I'll just simply tell you, don't you think that white bench that we saw in that first picture would look great right there? Drawing you in, it needs a focal point, this garden. Or maybe it's a maze garden. This is a design from my book. I love the idea of this. And on a larger scale, you could imagine how it could just be this wonderful labyrinth walk into the center. And then once the plants get really high, you can put a bench in the center there and sort of just get away and play hide and seek. This is a garden in Charlotte, Vermont, and the paths are a wonderful old brick that have been edged by that what we call New Hampshire granite stone. I'm not exactly sure what it's called, but you know, it has that wonderful cobblestone look. It has an old world look to it, and they're raised beds, but they're only slightly raised. They're just raised enough to hold that soil. And so really thinking about paths and how they work with the beds to keep the whole garden neat and tidy. This is a garden from that I saw on the Garden Conservancy, and it's in the Litchfield, Connecticut area, I believe. And I'm sure at one point it was probably, you know, gorgeous row of lavender with roses and perennials, but I love the way they've changed it and planted lettuce and peas. And this is a whole row of radicchio, which will turn a wonderful magenta red. There's one that's even starting to turn red. And I love the idea of parking your car at this end and walking through into the house while you pick and harvest your meal, all the wonderful lettuces and peas on the way. So paths also were very good for dog training. This is my little dog, Bella, and she was a puppy, and she was an Australian cattle dog, and she did need a little bit of training to stay in the path. And as you can see, she was very good by July. She knew exactly where the path was. So having some kind of path material so that the dogs understand the difference between dirt and path is very important. But more important than that, this path is 4 feet wide, and I know it looks really wide, but once that garden starts growing and those melons get out of control and the cucumbers that I should have trellised get out of control, you can see that you really need that 4-foot path to take up the slack. So step number 4, fences and gates. Every child is an artist. The problem is staying an artist when you grow up. And, you know, I believe every gardener is an artist. That's why we do this thing called gardening. We love it. It's a passion for us, but it's such a visual experience. And I use this quote here because I did go to art school. I spent 4 years in art school, and one of the things our teacher always told us that we couldn't show him a painting unless we had a picture frame around it. It had to be framed. It couldn't just be a canvas. And I think of our gardens in the same way, in that having a fence around that garden, sure, it keeps out deer, it keeps out groundhogs, it keeps out dogs and rabbits, but more than that, it's a lovely picture frame around that space, and it contains it and gives it life. So choosing what kind of fence you have around the garden will really be a reflection on your own garden. I love this garden. It's in Dorset, Vermont, and in Dorset, if any of you have visited us here, we have a lot of marble. Everybody just has marble in their backyard. I mean, what a luxury, right? And so this gardener has really played to that, and she's put marble steps in the center of those gardens and used marble, or at least a very white type of pebble for the paths and that white fence, and everything feels a little too white. But I love the way everything is contained, so that the perennial borders around the outside, and notice she has a nice table for entertaining in the evening, and in her garden shed, which is right here next to the garden, which is so convenient. She keeps all her garden tools and pots and things, but she also has a refrigerator, so she keeps chilled wine when she's entertaining. So that might be the other thing you take home with you, a bench and a refrigerator for chilled wine. The other garden I love so much is in Charlotte, Vermont. And this garden, I think, when is this taken? That looks like garlic growing. I'm trying to think what time of year. It's probably early spring. And it's just a very natural fence around the outside. But the structure is there. She's planned it out. She's put that focal point of the strawberry trellis in the center, because by August, this garden is so abundant that if she didn't have that structure, that framework around the garden, it would just be kind of an ordinary garden, but it gives it that lovely transition from the lawn into the garden area. Just such a spectacular garden. So maybe you'd like to paint your garden a historic color. This is some, Benjamin Moore color that's sort of a bluish gray that is a wonderful backdrop for that sage and the lavender and the other silvery green foliage. Or maybe you use your fence as a support system. So on one side you grow tomatoes, and on the other side you grow your tall flowers. It's a great combination to have flowers and vegetables growing together. That even looks like some kind of a trying to think what that plant is. But you can see having flowers and food next to each other, the bees will be very, very happy indeed. But also the plants will be happy if they have a fence to be able to grow on. This garden is in Londonderry, Vermont, and she's a flower gardener and a food gardener, and she's managed to mix her vegetable garden and her flower garden together. And I really adore those rustic arches. I've tried to imitate them many times, and then finally I had to ask her how she did it. And it's actually a metal rebar that's bent into a big hoop, and then every couple of years she'll go out in the woods and get saplings, green saplings, and wrap around that rebarb to keep them in place. And this is a Grandpa Ott's morning glory growing up the side there. You can see a little bit of that, and that reseeds itself very easily, so it will cover this wonderful trellis. And notice she has one here, and she also has one in the back. I don't know where it is now, but she has 3 of them, and so there's no gate around there, but she has an entranceway, a gate that marks again that transition from the lawn into the garden. Another gorgeous way to go into the space and into your garden. So having a gate of some kind is a really nice element. And that gate doesn't even have to be attached to a fence. This is my other dog, Ella, and you can see that morning glory growing over that rustic trellis in my backyard. And then the William Baffin rose growing on the left-hand side. How magnificent that is. And again, looking at that focal point, I'm trying to get my cursor here. The focal point is this bird bath here. It draws you into that space and makes you feel like you're in this magical secret garden. This garden is in New Hampshire, and the stonework was done by Dan Snow, and it's 5 feet tall, and so it's keeping the deer out. And then he built that wonderful little hobbit house in the background, and I helped with the design of the vegetable garden inside the gate here. But somebody very clever designed this lovely gate. I was thinking there would be some iron gate that would give it sort of a barricade look, but I love the way they've used this shape of these wonderful round stones in this design. So, gates are so important. Try and find something in an antique shop or have somebody specially design it for you, because it forms that gateway into that space. Again, that focal point. I know I'm doing a lot of talking, but I have a lot to get through here. So step number 5, plants. So I think this time of year, we're so often want to put everything in our garden. We go to the garden center and we want peppers and eggplants and tomatoes, and I'm the same way. I have piles of seeds that I haven't even started yet. And I think it's a very exciting time of year. But it's important to rein in what you're trying to do. There's a big difference between a vegetable garden and a kitchen garden. And the main difference is kitchen gardens are smaller, tend to be smaller, and you're not trying to grow everything. You're not growing corn and zucchini and the big crops. You're really just focused on the things that you really love, the things that you can't buy at the store, the French green beans, the wonderful mosh and European salad greens. And I have this quote: listen to your broccoli and your broccoli will tell you how to eat it. And it's kind of a funny quote. I'm not sure what Anne Lamott meant by it, but what I think about is you can grow broccoli And you're going to appreciate that broccoli so much more than the broccoli you buy for $1.49 at the grocery store. You're going to watch that the head start to develop. You're going to go out and talk to that plant and make sure it has plenty of water. And then by the time you actually harvest it, you're going to really appreciate that broccoli. It's not just going to be a vegetable that's on a side dish. It's going to be, I grew this kind of excitement. And so that's the beauty of growing your own food, is you get that wonderful pleasure of going from seed to table. And it takes a long time, but it's so exciting. So what to grow in a kitchen garden? I'm going to share with you what my favorites are. I always grow sweet basil, but I also grow a purple basil. I grow a lettuce leaf basil, which grows a leaf the size of your hand, and you can put a piece of fish in it and put it on the grill, and it will infuse it with basil flavor. I also grow a tiny little leaf basil called a piccolo verde basil, which is so pungent. It's really the essential pesto basil, but you're going to need 10 Italian grandmothers to help you harvest enough to make a batch of it. So really thinking about basil as going beyond sweet basil. There's a lot of there's actually 80 different kinds of basil you can grow, and they're all easy to grow from seed. So I always say, grow 80% tried and true and 20% new and different. And maybe you'd like to expand your basil, or grow culinary herbs. There's nothing more wonderful than baking bread with herbs and cheese. This is a recipe in my book. It's an herb cheese bread, and it's very, very easy to make. And it's just a quarter cup or a half a cup of all kinds of culinary chopped herbs. And there's nothing better for a cook than to have fresh herbs. I've recently just completely given up even having dried herbs in my kitchen. I just love fresh herbs so much that I figured out different ways to always have a supply of fresh herbs. Or mesclun. Mesclun really just means miscellaneous greens. It's what the peasants collected for centuries because it's so full of vitamins. The wild arugula, the chicories, the dandelion greens, the lettuces. So plant lots and lots of salad greens, and you're going to be healthy. Endive and chicories are great in the summer heat when you can't grow lettuce, and I've become a huge fan of growing this Batavian full heart endive, because I can just pluck a few leaves for the salad and I feel like I have something all summer long. And this is a gorgeous lettuce. I bet you wouldn't you wouldn't think that this is an iceberg lettuce, but it's actually a red iceberg lettuce. It was in some trial gardens that I saw in Pennsylvania. And I always think it's so magnificent. It's a reminder of how beautiful food is, and how sad it is that we have to buy lettuce in the grocery store with all the outer leaves peeled off of it, so we don't get to see it in its beautiful glory. So really appreciate the food that you're growing, and look at the beauty. Go beyond just what you can harvest, but how magnificent it is that a little seed can grow into a beautiful plant like this rainbow chard, or these peppers. This is the Jimmy Nardello pepper, which is an old heirloom variety, and you're not going to find that in the grocery store. You may find it in a farmer's market, but it looks like a hot pepper, but it's actually sweet. It has so much flavor. And the seeds were brought from Italy years and years ago from, an immigrant family who brought seeds, and it stayed in that family for generations. And now Seed Savers Exchange sells the seeds so we can grow them in our garden. And something like edible flowers, we all know about nasturtiums and maybe marigolds, but what about this beautiful blue flower up in the upper right-hand corner? That's a borage, and the butterflies and the bees adore that plant, and it has a cucumber flavor. And imagine how beautiful that is plopped onto a nice roasted tomato soup, and the contrast of that beautiful light blue with the red. Or an alpine strawberry. You're not going to find these in the market. They're so delicious, and I've just finished writing a book about heirloom gardens, and I think I was really inspired by the alpine strawberries that I have in my garden, because every time I taste them, they remind me of sitting in my grandmother's garden, and they just melt on your tongue. They're so delicious. Artichokes. I started growing artichokes. I just on a whim. I started planting them. I saw some in a nursery. I started with 4 plants. I had wonderful harvest. I started with 8 plants. I had a fabulous harvest, and now I grow about 12 to 18 plants. I put some in my flower bed and some in my vegetable garden. So, that was my 20% new and different, and it turned out to be very successful. Or something like tomatoes, experimenting with different kinds. Heirloom tomatoes have become a big thing now, but back when we started our seed catalog, nobody had really heard of heirloom tomatoes, and we would have tasting parties at our farm, and everybody loved that green zebra and the persimmon and the brandywine and the big rainbow, and we've continued to grow them ever since. The ground husk cherry, if you haven't tasted this, if you see it in the farmer's market or you want to try a plant, you will just be blown away by it. It has a butterscotch pineapple flavor, and these tiny little fruits grow inside those papery husks, and you peel them back and you pop them in your mouth, and oh, you just can't stop eating them. They're so delicious. So, experimenting with different things, and carrots are a great example of why you really should be growing your own food, because the flavor of carrots has been so diminished. It's one of those crops that really makes me kind of sad every time I go to the grocery store and I see bags of carrots and little tiny peeled carrots, and there's a reason they sell them next to the dips, because they have no flavor anymore. They have no carrot flavor, because they've been bred for so many years now to have strong tops so that they can be mechanically harvested. And instead, if you're growing your own, look for those heirloom varieties, the Scarlet Nantes and the Touchon varieties that have real carrot flavor, and you'll just never go back to supermarket carrots again. And something like potatoes. I don't really have enough room to grow potatoes, but I love the variety of the Peruvian all blue potatoes and the Russian banana potatoes and the French fingerlings. And another reason to grow heirloom varieties is because we're losing the diversity of some of these old crops. When we go to the grocery store and all we can get are russets or red potatoes, or I guess we can get Yukon Golds now. Those are only fairly recent development. But when you think about the hundreds of different kinds of potatoes that you could grow if you were growing your own, it just makes you want to get up and jump up and sing. It's so exciting. All right, last step here, personality. How do you take all these elements? We're all gardeners, and how do you take seed and soil and plants, and each one of us comes up with our own designs. So I'm just going to share with you a few ways to maybe have more fun in your garden. I think really that's the message I want to get across to you, is that we often think of the garden as work. A lot of us have flower gardens, but we don't have vegetable gardens because vegetables seem like work. But when you make your vegetable garden more fun, and it makes you smile when you go into the garden, and you create little play areas where you can go out and have tea, or you have a bench that's surrounded by vines and a wonderful old watering can. You're having fun in that garden. You're realizing that your garden is more than just a place to grow food. It's a place to engage with nature and to enjoy and to express your own creativity with your design, of your sense of color and texture. I'm a beekeeper, and these are my Italian bees. I actually am no longer a beekeeper because I had a bear come and destroy my hives not too long ago. But I loved having bees because they're a reminder that bees are part of our nature. Our gardens are about feeding us, but they're always about connecting with all the nature and the abundance that's all around us, and just spending some time outside on your bench and noticing things and observing and stop doing and just being. That's what I'm trying to do more of this time of year. This is an old antique watering can. Maybe you have an antique watering can in your garden shed. I know I do, and it has a big hole in it, but I like bringing it out and just putting it in the garden as a reminder of my grandmother, who used to water her garden with a giant watering can, and having fun, maybe setting up a treasure hunt for your cocktail guests, putting things around the garden and that you enjoy, that you love. It's really about having whimsy and making you smile. So I'm just going to leave you with a few designs from my first book. This is a salad lover's garden. And just share what you love with others. You know, this is, look at that magnificent cabbage. I absolutely adore this photo. I did swipe it off the internet, and it's at the Chelsea Flower Show, but I love that cabbage. I mean, the actual cabbage is in the center there, but look at the outer leaves of that magnificent plant. The paint box garden, which is a way to put your raised beds instead of right next to each other like a graveyard garden, to set them up on edge and have a little bit more artsy style to it. And remember to play with your food in the garden and in the kitchen to really enjoy what you're harvesting. And invite friends over, and invite friends to garden with you. I'm finding that at some of my garden lectures that I do, that more and more of us are getting kind of tired of having that big 60 by 40 garden. And so we're inviting other people to share that space. And especially with all these new young people who are so excited about growing food now, and they need mentors. So I think we all need to be mentors for new gardeners. So I'm going to leave you with this final quote. There are only two things in life that money can't buy: true love and homegrown tomatoes. So thank you very much. I hope I've inspired you to start visualizing your own design, and start by taking a look at your whole landscape. This is taken with a drone looking down on my yard, my little house, and my little yard. It's only a 1/4 acre, but you can see here my little kitchen garden, and these yellow things are chairs. They're sitting outside, and you can see my 5-year plan is really coming together finally, after all these years. So after this talk, I hope you'll start your own 5-year plan and figure out how you're going to put those things together, and start by drawing your house and where you want to put your garden, and looking at where south is. And these are not my designs, but again, they're just things that people have done in my garden class to really remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something that you really want to design from the start. It might be a 4 square like this that can then turn into that crop rotation that we talked about, with the legumes and the roots and the fruits and the leafy greens, and then making a plant list. And then that 4 square can be added on to. This was our garden when we had our family, and we started with the 4 square, but then we added lilies and asparagus, and then we put in a children's playhouse here. So this is how my garden looks now. I've changed that bark mulch path, and now I have stone in it, and remembering that you can always make changes. You can see how the garden started many years ago, and my bench, that one that I showed you right in the beginning, and that's how it looks. So that's the end, and thank you very much. And if you want help with your design, I'm happy to help, and I hope I see all of you in November. So thank you.
Ellen, thank you so much. I think you packed a ton into 1 hour. In the chat, if people didn't see it, we did put the link that is the 6 steps to successful design. You also can find that link on the cthort.org website, our website. It's listed right underneath Ellen's information. So we are going to take some questions if people want to put those in the chat. So for those that are maybe on a phone, if you touch at the bottom of the phone, you'll see an area where it will say like participants, more, and when you hit the more, that's where the chat is. If you're on a computer, at the bottom of the screen, listing next to some different buttons, you'll see one that says chat. It'll bring up a little area, and you just type your question in. So if people want to add any questions, we can go ahead and certainly answer those as well.
Guess nobody has any questions?
You've done such a great job that you've answered these questions. Oh, here we go.
This one. Okay, is your book available in national bookstores? You know, this book has been out for a while. It's on Amazon, I hate to say, but you can also order it through your independent bookstores. It's gone through 5 printings, and so ask at your independent bookstore first to see if you can get it. And but most bookstores have so many garden books that most of them, except for my local one here, is not putting it out front and center. But yes, it's still available, of course, and it's on my website too, of course. Okay.
So suggestions for some rabbit-proof veggies.
Oh man, this is a tough one. Rabbits. How do I say this? You know, I have always had dogs, so I don't tend to have too many problems with rabbits. And but last year I did, and what I found, and this was a strategy that we've always used, that if you plant enough for the rabbits, they won't eat everything. But I found that the first crop of lettuce they decimated, but then they had so much else to eat that they didn't come back. So to answer your question, probably not. I mean, cabbages, you know, thick leaf things. But they love those tender greens. They love the tops of carrots. I just live with them. I actually like rabbits quite a bit, but you're right, they can do a lot of damage. It's all right, sorry.
How do you deal with slugs?
Oh, I don't have slugs. Actually, I do. I don't mean to say, oh, I don't have slugs. But, you know, slugs are kind of, they happen when you have a lot of plants close together and you've got a lot of rain, and they mostly attack leaves that are low to the ground. And I mostly have them on my flowers, but I don't really have them in my vegetable bed, and I don't know why. So I don't really have problems with slugs at the moment. Sorry. Beer, everybody says beer works. I just pick them off and throw them in my neighbor's yard.
How about strategies for keeping deer out?
These are all the questions I always get. And I always say to people, you know, my focus is on design. It's not necessarily about rabbits and deer. And I know it's a problem we all struggle with. I've been lucky in that I don't have a deer problem. In Vermont, we harvest our deer, so I've never seen them in my backyard. So I can't answer that question. You're going to have to go to somebody else. I'm sorry. Any other questions? Oh, I'm losing people. I can see we're down to 56 now. I mean, deer, you know, I put, sometimes I know my mom has problems down on the Cape with her deer, and there's lots of things now that people use, you know, this scented things, spraying things. In my vegetable garden, it's somewhat enclosed, and they don't want to go into enclosed spaces. And so it hasn't been an issue for me. There's a secret to growing eggplant successfully. Start with big plants. I mean, you know, when I start them, they're usually that big, but I'll often buy them. I don't tend to grow eggplants because I'm not crazy about eggplant, but if I were to grow eggplant, I'd probably grow the kind that were small, those Asian eggplants where they're not too big. They're not the typical big Italian kinds. And a lot of heat. They're a flowering crop, so they like to have, is it potassium, phosphorus? I always get those two confused. They're flowering crops, so when you're doing it in the rotation, you want to put them in the bed with the other flowering crops. And I don't know, they require pollinators, so just make sure you have things that are bringing in pollinators as well.
Ellen, how about irrigation? Do you use it, or do you use in-ground?
No, I don't use in-ground. I'm not very good about irrigating my garden, but I have incredible soil, and it didn't start off very well. I didn't show you pictures of my soil before and after because I can't show you everything, but my soil is now what I call like chocolate cake. It has tilth and it has nutrition in it, and it actually it tends to hold moisture in it after it rains. And I don't know, it seems to me that pretty much in the summer I don't need to water it separately. I water my onions because I'm never very successful with my onions, but I don't spend a lot of time with the sprinkler. When we used to grow food for the restaurants, we would just have the sprinklers going all the time, and it would run the wells dry. But I just really believe in good soil and feel that that's the most important thing you can do for your garden, and your plants we pretty much take care of themselves.
Here's a great one. Do you have design ideas for maximizing growing space?
Ooh. Yes, layering. small on the bottom, medium, tall. Like my artichokes are tall, and then I'll put the basil as a mid-level, and then I'll do nasturtiums underneath, and it makes a gorgeous combination. Lettuce, spinach, things that are low growing right next to where the peas are because they're high growing. So be thinking about, you know, how plants grow in the garden. And again, in my book, I have designs, and I sort of tell you where to put things, everything low around the front edges, and then medium, and then growing to the top. You know, there's one of those garden designs that I showed you that in the very back were the tall with the sunflowers and the beans. So really knowing which way the direction of the sun is coming from, so you know where south is, so you know that every plant that's in your garden is going to get enough sun, is very important too. I love this question. How do you deal with weed seeds in the compost? I don't put my weeds in the compost. I have two kinds of compost. I have a hot compost and a cold compost. And the cold compost is something that is way back along the boundaries of the house, where I just dump things into it, and those will decompose on their own. And then my hot compost is the compost that I actually work, and I'm turning that every week. It's a 2-bin system. If you go to my Instagram site, you can see my compost pile, and it works really, really well. And I'm always using the pitchfork and turning it and keeping it heated. You can put your weed seeds in the hot compost if you think you're going to be good about getting the compost up to a high enough temperature so that it will actually you know, burn out those weeds. But I never put weed seeds in my compost for that reason. Unfortunately, I have weeds like everybody else, but I don't have maybe as much. Very careful with my soil. Soil is, to me, the king of everything, the kingpin of everything. I'm slowly turning my deck into a kitchen garden. Great. Any additional suggestions for making a deck garden pretty? Oh, I love that idea. The bigger the pot, the easier it is. If you can buy whiskey barrels or big, wonderful pots, it's not going to dry out as much. I think that's the biggest problem with any kind of raised bed garden or container gardens, is that they dry out. So, you know, you go away for the day and your poor plants are really thirsty. And so big pots. And I love height. I do a lot of things with height. I buy bamboo by the 50-pack from a company called H.M. Leonard. And I'm always building trellises. I just don't, I don't know. It's one of these things. I don't like flat gardens. I like things that are tall. And so I'm always growing runner beans and morning glories and sweet peas and all kinds of stuff up. So that's what I would recommend, that if you can get some bamboo from your hardware store or from a wonderful garden store and make a teepee so you can grow some vines up it, and then have something around the base of it that kind of spill over. There's a term for it with spills, thrills, and something or other. That's, you know, everybody uses when they talk about container going, but that's how I would do my patio garden. Deck garden. What rules do you follow? Which sorts of plants grow well with what? Oh, companion planting. Yeah, there's lots of charts on companion planting, and I do it, but I mostly put things together that for color, I guess. I mean, I don't really follow any certain rules. Do you mulch your vegetable beds? No, I don't, but I do go through with a hoe every single week and just kind of churn up the soil. Sometimes I just do it with my hand. Sometimes I do it with one of those hand cultivators, because I think it's really important to keep the soil loose and arid. One of the things not arid, but, you know, loose and air, filled with air, because it's going to help with the root system. It's going to help be able to absorb whatever moisture it can, since I don't do any extra watering. How do you build your soil up? That's a whole talk in itself. And when I first started, I did cover crops a lot, and I do a lot of compost every year. I put compost on. It's really building up the texture of the soil. And I still do compost and cover crops. What else can I say? It's organic. I sometimes put on an organic fertilizer, but not very often. It's really a science, you know. You just have to read about soil and learn how to do. When you see good soil, you know it has to be sweet. and I often say it's like chocolate cake, that if you squeeze it, it will sort of hold its shape because it's holding all that moisture in it. And it's, I don't know, you've got to love your soil, and bag soil is not going to do it, really. I'm sorry to say. I guess we're running out of questions. I'm not very good at answering all these questions. I'm sorry.
No, you're doing a great job. I think a lot of it came in just was about soil and building up the soil. What do you
There's
do to
about
build up?
favorite edible flowers. This is fun.
Yeah.
I love getting these questions. Edible flowers, my favorite edible flowers. I love nasturtiums. I grow about 20 different kinds of nasturtiums. I grow everything from a peach melba, which is a tiny little one, to a moonlight, which is a trailing type. I always grow the borage, that tiny little blue flower. Chives, of course. What else do I grow? I grow a lot of edible flowers, but not specifically for edible flowers, but mostly just because I like putting flowers in my kitchen garden, and it seems to make sense. Pansies, violas. If you go on my Instagram, I just posted a wonderful photo of a dark black viola that I started from seed.
Well, thank you so much. I think the information today was just great, and we
Oh,
did it
good.
in our exact time period. So
Okay.
remember, we have our next speaker coming up in June, so you can certainly look at the website, cthort.org. Unfortunately, we are not going to hold the meeting in person. We are going to do this via Zoom, which I think, Ellen, you've done a great job today of setting the bar very high for us. And the last thing I thought that we might do for those that have a couple minutes or two, I know one of the things the society is all about is us getting together and seeing each other. And you've listened to a lot. What I wanted to use is one of the features that Zoom has is a thing called breakout sessions. And what it allows us to do is for those that are on this call, we can actually let you go into separate rooms and talk to just a few of the members. And this way we can maybe have some connection, because I know a lot of people have not been able to connect with anybody. So I thought I would just do this very quickly for you. What I want you to think about is either one question, which is what are you most what are you looking forward to after this talk growing, maybe in your garden, and or what are you most looking forward to doing with the Memorial Day weekend? So we're going to break you into some rooms. We're going to do this. There's 50 people on, 30. So we'll break this into 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yep, you're losing them.
12, and you guys can give it a go. I know you're all my introverts that are a little worried, so go ahead. You just kind of will give it a try. It's for 1 minute, and we'll go from there. They all ran away, right? No, so people are joining rooms.
Hi, Ellen. DB. I loved your cat. Yeah, she walks behind you a couple of times. I am. We have a cat who loves sitting out on our deck because we do live in a condo, so I'm limited to my deck pretty much. But the cat loves it. It's a second story deck. We have a walkout basement below it, so he can't leave it. So he loves sitting out there. He chatters with the birds. It's been great during this whole quarantine thing. At least it's someplace to get outside, and I work and travel. So mostly it's canceling and refunding things.
Hello.
So we're trying to find some other opportunities to maybe make some money, whether it be like opening up an online
How do I talk to anybody? Hi. Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob.
Oh, can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
I finally figured out where the microphone unmute was.
I picked you, and hi, Michael.
But yeah, but I don't think anybody's left, so I think we should do the dishes and go to bed.
Oh,
I think I'm going to build a bench for my garden.
I know some of you figured out how to unmute and a lot of people kind of left off, but we will actually do a
Ellen.
event where we just let everybody kind of come in and do a cocktail party. So that's one of the ideas that we have, as well as some very quick, just kind of open questions. I know a lot of you know Kevin Wilcox, who's one of our great members, has a ton of knowledge. So we're hoping to get him roped in here to do some of these learning type things on just a small scale. So I thank you all for sticking around. There's about 20 of us that are still left in here. So I think we should give Ellen a big hand for doing a great job for us.
It's my pleasure. Look at that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we will have the video, and we'll edit the beginning and the end, Ellen, so it doesn't have any of that on it. And I think it will be a really nice piece. I think you did a great job.
It's nice to see you. Nice to see you, Ellen. Look at the background.
Oh,
Wow. Tell me how to do that.
Yeah, it's fun.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, wow, Ellen.
Well,
Very cool.
How do you do that?
the background is really fun.
Yeah, you just put a file back there. That's, I can't remember the file size offhand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can do all kinds of neat things.
Yeah, it's if you have the green screen, Ellen.
I don't have a green screen.
It's actually virtual backgrounds.
No,
Yeah, but
Like
you have to have a computer that's got the
you
newer
have-
operating system.
Yeah, and I
Right.
don't think I have that.
No, I have a dinosaur.
Then you don't have to.
All right,
Screen.
I'm actually going back out to the garden, so I'm going to say goodnight, but thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
You guys have a
Bye.
great
Bye.
night.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us.
Bye.
Bye, Ellen.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.